in 2010, I was backpacking through Central America. I became stuck at the border between Costa Rica and Panama, and there was a man in this bus shelter who came up to me, and he had these, I remember, these wild eyes and this crazy half dreadlocked hair, and he said to me, I want to tell you about a murder that happened here 25 years ago, and he could obviously see that I wasn't a local, so he'd come up to me with this story, and I thought, oh, here we go. And I later found out that everything that he told me was true. Now, the man who was murdered at this crossing was Dr. Hugo Spadafra. He was a physician, a revolutionary, much like Che Guevara was to Cuba. And he was also a bold critic of Manuel Noriega, Panama's dictator. And he'd come through returning to Panama carrying a briefcase. Now, in that briefcase was information, documents that he had told others would expose Noriega's drug trafficking and his corrupt relationship with the CIA. And he never made it through to Panama City. Not far from that border crossing, there's a small bridge, and below that bridge is where they found his body. This was September 14th, 1985, and he was decapitated. They found his teeth on the bridge nearby, and they never found his head. And this man is telling me this story, and I'm thinking, geez, welcome to Panama. Wow. And there was something about that murder, there was something about the doctor himself that I became obsessed with. We don't know exactly what happened. What we do know is that Noriega was on the CIA payroll for many years after the US knew that he was trafficking drugs. And at the same time, he was playing the Cubans, he was playing the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar, yet the CIA continued to have that relationship with him. And we also know that Noriega kept a catalogue, an archive of evidence, which included tape recordings. And he used those tape recordings for blackmail. But also, more disturbingly, what was the actual reasons behind the US invasion of Panama in 1989? And so, with all these gaps, it was perfect to fill with a novel, and that's why I started writing what's become the Noriega Tapes. It's a big call to make, to suggest that the US invaded Panama, not just to arrest Noriega, but basically to cover up what he knew, to ensure that he couldn't talk. And I don't necessarily believe that's the case. I think that's something to be discussed. But what I do believe is the invasion itself was absurdly excessive. I mean, 27,000 troops dropped into Panama at midnight to arrest one man. And the destruction of the buildings that occurred, the deaths that occurred, hundreds, potentially thousands of Panamanian civilians were killed during that invasion, simply to arrest Noriega.
The footage you're looking at covers what remains of the Comandancia. It is burning to the ground. There's still sporadic fire coming out in and around the Comandancia.
As we delve into the reasons and theories around that invasion, we look at what Noriega's relationship was with the US, in particular, the man who ordered the invasion. Now, that, for many who are familiar with it, was George Bush Sr. Now, Noriega and George Bush Sr. had a testy relationship for a number of years, since the time that, that Bush was the director of the CIA. There's actually a quote that Noriega said before the invasion, and he said, "I've got Bush by the balls."
As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens. And that is why I directed our armed forces to protect the lives of American citizens in Panama and to bring General Noriega to justice in the United States.
So this book it's been a long journey. It's been 8 years in the making. And to get it out here, it really begs the question for me, which is, can a career in writing actually compete with a career in mining? And I actually started an arts and science degree. I went with geology, really, for two reasons. Firstly, I loved the outdoors, but also there was a mining boom in Australia at that time, and the prospects for a job were far greater than within the arts. But I'm glad to say I did really maintain, as much as I could throughout university, a connection, certainly with writing. I spent a year of university at Cornell in upstate New York, and I was lucky enough to get a job as an actor and as a theatre director for an acting troupe there, and part of that role was to write skits which we would perform. So that was very much something that, that kept me in tune, but since then the technical career and that push for the role in mining was something that took me away from writing. I guess in my belief, a writer's biggest weakness, certainly for myself years ago, was just writing on a whim, not having a structure, not knowing how the story is going to end. And the way I approached this book was very much scientific. It was highly categorical, and I think a lot of writers would cringe in me saying this, but I actually structured the whole thing before I wrote it in Microsoft Excel. And I chose the sequence of the chapters and the twists and the development in the plot to align with what I was structuring there. And then I used several other programs to actually develop and get that structure right before I really started to write. Another technique I use, which I think again may upset some writers, is that they actually dumped out the book into a stats program, and taking all the words and then analysing the verbs and adjectives and realising actually where I was duplicating much of my language. So I approached it again in quite a scientific way. I don't know if that's something other writers have done. I certainly in discussions haven't heard that before, but it really helped. It worked. And I guess the other thing that really worked for me in writing was that I put this book down for 2 years. I left it. And while I feel guilty about that, I guess on the flip side, it was fantastic to come back and look at it again through a different lens, to look at it slightly older, slightly more mature, and to see some fundamental flaws or some changes in the structure that I thought were going to make it a better book. So what inspired me about Noriega? On the surface, Noriega is just like every other tyrant or dictator. He ruled Panama with an iron fist. He delayed and manipulated elections. He terrorized his opponents. But what really differentiates him from the likes of Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Fidel Castro, was the fact that his rise to power was not through brutality, but through blackmail. He was the young army officer in the corner of the bar who was sitting there watching, judging, recording. And Panama in the 1970s and 80s was a place of rampant corruption, of drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering. You couldn't have lived during that era in Panama with not being exposed to some sort of criminal enterprise. And Noriega exploited that. He knew who his bosses mistresses were. He knew where they lent money from. He knew where they stored their stash of cocaine. And he used that information throughout his career to great effect. Noriega knew all of their secrets and he used it.